When I opened the garage, the only thing left was the oil stain, like a ghost of the life they'd just stolen. My name is Emily Harper, 42. I work in finance, the kind of job that runs on coffee, deadlines, and loyalty. I'd just flown home from London, proud of what I'd built. But pride doesn't prepare you for betrayal. The garage door rolled open slowly, metal creaking like it already knew. My Dodge Challenger, gone. Just an empty space and a faint scent of engine oil. 6 years of sweat and sacrifice vanished. I dropped my suitcase in the hallway and walked into the kitchen. My parents and my younger sister were waiting, silent, their faces pale but practiced. They weren't surprised. They were prepared. My mother spoke first. "Emily, we need to talk about your car." They had pawned it. My car, the one I bought with every overtime bonus, every missed birthday, every lonely night at my desk. They said it was a family decision. My sister needed funds for her business. I remember my father couldn't even look at me. That's when I realized something. Families don't just take what's yours. They test what you'll allow. If you're watching this, tell me where you're listening from. Maybe you've been the one who always gives, always fixes, always forgives. Maybe you've learned the hard way that silence isn't peace, it's permission. And if this story hits close to home, subscribe and share your story below. Sometimes, speaking out is how healing begins. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, the city lights flickering against my reflection. I kept hearing my mother's voice. Family helps family. And I realized she never said which direction that help was supposed to go. By dawn, the grief had hardened into clarity. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg for fairness. I was going to find the truth, piece by piece, every forged paper, every lie they buried under love. Because justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about reclaiming your voice, and proving once and for all that respect is earned, not inherited. And it all started with an empty garage and the echo of my grandfather's words. Don't let anyone borrow your worth. That morning, the sun came through the blinds like an accusation. My suitcase was still by the door, half open, as if I hadn't truly arrived home. I brewed coffee I didn't drink, just to have something to hold. The quiet felt heavier than anger. It was the kind that comes when you finally see the truth and can't unsee it. I opened my laptop. Numbers, contracts, transactions. Those were my world, and I decided to treat this betrayal like one. A case, not a heartbreak, not even a family issue, just a transaction gone wrong. I started where any analyst would, with evidence. My parents thought I would walk away, but they forgot who I was. The daughter who built a career out of tracking missing dollars. By noon, I was driving toward the address I'd found on my father's auto insurance statement, Cornerstone Pawn and Loan. The name itself felt dirty in my mouth. The building was small, squat, with barred windows and a fading sign. The air inside smelled like metal and tired dreams. Behind the counter stood a man with thinning hair and kind eyes that had seen too much. His name tag read, Gordon. "Can I help you?" he asked without looking up. "I think you already have," I said quietly, sliding my phone across the counter. A 2021 black Dodge Challenger, brought in about 5 days ago. This is the ticket number, he typed it in, eyes narrowing as the record appeared. "That's a nice car," he said softly, and then, after a pause, "Loan for $45,000. You here to make a payment?" "No," I said, my voice steady. "I'm here to prove I never signed that loan." He looked up, startled now. I placed my driver's license on the counter beside a neatly folded folder, title, insurance, purchase receipt, my identity, in black and white. He hesitated. "Ma'am, I can't share client details unless I am the client," I finished. "Check the signature." Gordon flipped through the file, then stopped. He frowned. "That's not the same." I took out a pen and signed my name on a scrap of paper. "Look at the M. Look at the N." I tapped the forged document. Whoever did this tried to copy me, but they didn't know me well enough to get it right. His eyes softened. The tired kind of sympathy, the one that understands what families can do to each other. "I'll get my manager," he murmured. A few minutes later, a man in a wrinkled tie appeared. "Mr. Ellis." He listened as I explained, calmly, clearly. I didn't tremble, didn't shout. I was a woman stating facts. When I finished, he ran a hand over his face. "This is serious," he said. "Identity theft, title fraud. We'll have to report it to the police." My chest tightened. For a moment, I imagined the flashing lights outside my parents' house, my mother's voice breaking, my father's silence. Justice, yes, but not like that. Not in handcuffs. "No," I said softly. "Not yet." He looked surprised. "You don't want to file a report?" "Not today. I'll give them a chance to fix it. But I need one thing from you. The payoff amount." He tapped a few keys. $47,250, and you've got 25 days before auction. "Then I'll find a way," I said. When I walked out of that pawn shop, the autumn air felt sharper, cleaner. I had the truth, the photos of the forged signature, the receipt, the proof I'd been looking for. My parents hadn't made a mistake. They had made a choice. Driving back, I stopped at a red light and caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes didn't look sad anymore. They looked awake. That night, I sat at the hotel desk and wrote a letter. Not an angry one, but the kind that records what silence can't. "You didn't just take a car," I wrote. "You took the one thing I built that no one gave me. But you forgot who you raised. You forgot that I don't break quietly. I rebuild." Then I folded it, sealed it, and left it on the hotel nightstand. Not to send, just to remind myself that I still had power. Outside, Denver hummed like a living thing, headlights sliding across wet streets, distant trains echoing through the cold. Somewhere in that sound, I heard my grandfather's voice again. "Real justice, Emily, isn't about who loses. It's about who learns." And that was when I knew. The next chapter wouldn't be about revenge, it would be about accountability, and maybe, just maybe, healing. The next morning, I drove past my parents' house but didn't stop. The curtains were drawn, the lawn too perfect, like a stage set that hid the mess behind it. I wasn't ready to confront them. Not yet. I needed one more piece of truth. Not from documents, but from the people who had built this story around me. I parked near the park where I used to play as a kid. The air smelled of pine and wet leaves. I sat there in silence, thinking about what Mr. Ellis had said. This is a crime. He was right. But so was my heart. This was also a wound. And I didn't want to fight it with handcuffs. I wanted to face it with clarity. So I called my uncle, Robert Harper, my father's older brother, and the only person who had ever told me, "You don't owe your family blindness just because you love them." When he picked up, his voice carried that gravelly warmth I remembered from childhood. "Emily? You sound tired, I am," I said softly. "They pawned my car. And they forged my name." For a second, the line went quiet. Then he said, "I knew this day would come." His tone wasn't shocked, just deeply sad. "Your parents have always protected Haley from consequences. You were the safety net, but even nets have limits. I went to the pawn shop," I continued. "I have proof. But I didn't call the police." "Good," he said firmly. "That's not weakness. That's control. Keep that. I'm coming to Denver." He hung up before I could protest. For the first time in days, I didn't feel alone. Someone had chosen my side, not out of pity, but out of principle. That evening, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Calls from my Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister, the family's self-appointed diplomat. I let it ring 5 times before I picked up. "Emily," she began, her voice syrupy sweet, "your mother is devastated. Haley is in pieces. She didn't mean to hurt you. She forged my name," I said flatly. "Oh, honey, that's such an ugly word. Let's not exaggerate. Families share things, cars, accounts. They share trust, I interrupted, not identities. The sweetness in her tone cracked. Don't do this. You'll tear the family apart. No, I said quietly. They already did that. I'm just not pretending it's whole anymore. When I hung up, I felt oddly calm. I wasn't raging. I wasn't crying. I was simply done. That night, I drove back to my hotel and found a message waiting for me at the front desk. A handwritten note from Uncle Robert. Don't speak to them yet. Let me get there. Some fights need witnesses. He arrived the next morning, tall, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, wearing the same leather jacket that used to smell of sawdust and motor oil when I was little. The sight of him hit me harder than I expected. He was a reminder that decency still ran in my blood somewhere. We sat in the hotel lobby over coffee gone cold. I showed him the forged paperwork, the pawn ticket, the receipt. He read every word slowly, jaw tight, eyes burning with quiet fury. They've turned love into a transaction, he muttered, but you're not going to pay interest on their mistakes anymore. He looked up at me. You ready to face them? I nodded, but my voice betrayed me. I don't know if I'm angry or just tired. Good, he said. Tired people don't yell. They change things. That evening, my mother called. Her voice was too cheerful, too rehearsed. Sweetheart, we're having dinner tomorrow. Your father wants everyone together, to talk. I almost laughed, to talk. What she meant was to control. I'll be there, I said, and Uncle Robert will too. There was silence on the other end. Then a brittle, oh, of course. The next day at 6, we pulled up to my parents' house. The lights glowed warm, the table set with the good china, their favorite disguise for guilt. My father stood at the head, Haley to his right, eyes red and swollen. My mother greeted us with a strained smile. Robert, she said tightly, we weren't expecting— I know, he interrupted. That's the point. We sat. The air was thick with politeness and lies. For a few minutes, they made small talk, about London, about my job. I let them circle the edges until my mother finally said, Emily, we made a mistake. But you're successful. You can replace the car. Haley just needed a chance. I looked at her. A chance to do what? Commit fraud? Her face stiffened. That's a cruel word. It's the correct one. I reached into my folder and slid the printed law across the table. Title fraud, identity theft, forgery, Class 5 felony. My father's hands trembled as he read. My mother's breath hitched. Haley covered her face. I'm not here to destroy you, I said softly. I'm here to hold you accountable. Uncle Robert leaned forward, his voice firm but calm. You raised a daughter who became everything you wanted her to be, strong, capable, decent, and you punished her for it. That ends tonight. No one spoke. Even the ticking wall clock seemed to pause. Finally, my father whispered, What do you want from us? Responsibility, I said, and honesty. You have 10 days to make this right. After that, I take it to the police. My mother tried to protest, but Uncle Robert stopped her with one look. That night, as we left, I looked back through the doorway, at the people who had taught me everything except how to be loved fairly. Their faces were pale, small, and for the first time, afraid of losing me. It wasn't revenge I felt, it was closure beginning to take shape. Outside, the night air felt sharp and clean. Robert turned to me as we reached the car. You okay, kid? I think so, I said quietly. It's strange. I thought justice would feel loud. He smiled. Real justice rarely does. And in that stillness I realized what I wanted wasn't their punishment, it was their reckoning. The next morning, Denver's sky was pale and heavy, the kind of gray that made everything look honest. I hadn't slept much. I kept replaying the dinner in my mind, the fear in my mother's eyes, the trembling in my father's hands, the way Haley stared at her plate as if the truth might disappear if she didn't look up. When my phone rang, I expected silence. Instead, it was Mr. Ellis from the pawn shop. "Miss Harper?" he said carefully. "I wanted to inform you. Our underwriters reviewed the file. Because it was a fraudulent loan, they're accelerating the process. The auction date has been moved up." My stomach dropped. "How soon?" 10 days. You'll need to pay $47,250 to reclaim full ownership." 10 days. It felt like time itself was testing me. I called Uncle Robert immediately. He didn't sound surprised. "They lit the fire," he said. "Now they get to stand in the smoke. Don't save them. Guide them." That afternoon, we met in my hotel room, me, Robert, and Jessica, my best friend, who had flown in after hearing the story. Jessica had always been my calm in every storm. "You can't fix them, Em," she said quietly, "but you can show them what fixing looks like." We decided on a simple plan. They would pay, not because they could afford it, but because they needed to learn what responsibility costs. The next morning, Robert called my father on speaker. His voice was firm. "Richard, the pawn shop's giving you 10 days, $47,250. You started this. Now you finish it." My father's voice came through small, broken. "Robert, we don't have that kind of money." "Then sell the car you bought for Haley," Robert said without hesitation. "Sell the jewelry. Borrow. Work. You have 10 days to clean your own mess." For once, my father didn't argue. He just said, "We'll try." And so the countdown began. Day 1. Haley listed her shiny red Volkswagen online, the same car they'd given her while calling my own dreams unnecessary. She cried as she handed the keys to a stranger, wiping her tears with a designer sleeve. $8,000, the first piece of their debt. Day 3. My mother went downtown to a small jewelry shop she used to brag about. She sold her diamond earrings and a pearl necklace she inherited from her mother. She returned home with $4,200 and a silence that weighed heavier than any apology. Day 4. My father walked into the factory where he had worked for 30 years before retirement. He asked for night shifts, midnight to 8 a.m. The supervisor hesitated, then, seeing his trembling hands, simply nodded. My father spent the next week loading crates until his palms blistered. He brought home $350 in cash. Day 5, I got a call from Jessica. "They're trying," she said softly. "It doesn't fix the past, but maybe it's the beginning." I wanted to believe her, but part of me stayed guarded. It wasn't money I wanted, it was recognition. I wanted them to see me not as the endless giver, but as the daughter they had wronged. Meanwhile, I wasn't idle. I called my director at work and explained I needed an early payout on my performance bonus. I had closed a major account in London. Within 2 days, $15,000 landed in my account. I didn't tell my family. It wasn't a rescue fund. It was my backup plan, in case they failed again. By day 7, my father's voice sounded rough when he called. "Emily, we have $19,500. It's everything we could gather. The bank refused the loan. We sold what we could." I said nothing for a moment. The silence stretched until he whispered, "I'm sorry, Em." "I really am." That night, I sat on the edge of my hotel bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, I wondered if this, watching them struggle, was justice or cruelty. But then I remembered, healing isn't comfort, it's honesty, and honesty sometimes hurts. Day 9. Robert came to my room with a checkbook in hand. "You've given them enough pain," he said quietly. "Let me cover the rest." This isn't charity, it's balance. He wrote a check for $13,000. He made it out to me, not to them. "Family helps family," he said, but this time it meant something true. Day 10. I stood in the parking lot of Cornerstone Pawn, the cold wind biting through my coat. I handed Mr. Ellis a cashier's check for the full amount, $47,250. He looked almost relieved. "It's all cleared," he said. "We'll have the car brought around." A minute later, I heard it. That deep, steady rumble I'd missed. My Challenger rolled into the sunlight, dusty, but proud. The sight hit me like a heartbeat returning. I ran my hand along the hood. It wasn't about the car anymore. It was about ownership, of my choices, my boundaries, my voice. When I drove away, I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just breathed. For the first time in weeks, the air didn't taste like loss. It tasted like resolve. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Sunday dinner, 5 p.m. Dad's grilling steaks. Please come." I stared at the screen for a long time. Part of me wanted to delete it, but another part, the part my grandfather would have called the builder, whispered, "Go." So I replied, "I'll be there." Because sometimes justice doesn't end when you win back what's yours. Sometimes it begins when you decide what happens next. Sunday came with the soft hum of spring rain. I drove my Challenger to my parents' house, the wipers brushing away a thin layer of memory from the windshield. The same driveway that once felt like belonging now felt neutral ground, not home, not enemy territory, just a place where truth was waiting. The smell of grilled steak drifted through the open kitchen window. My father stood at the counter, his movements slow, deliberate. My mother was setting the table, not with the good china this time, just the everyday plates. There were no flowers, no pretense. It was the first honest dinner we'd had in years. We ate mostly in silence. No one mentioned the car. No one asked about London or work. It was as if small talk had finally surrendered to reality. Then my father cleared his throat. His hand trembled as he pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. I wrote something down, he said. I don't trust myself to say it right. He unfolded the paper, his eyes wet before the words even began. "Emily," he read, voice low and shaking, "I failed you as a father. I stood by while your mother and sister hurt you. I helped them. I told myself it was for peace, but peace built on silence is cowardice. I'm sorry for every time I made you feel small for being strong." His voice broke on the last sentence. He lowered the paper, unable to meet my eyes. Across the table, my mother's face was pale, drawn. For once, she didn't defend herself. She just said, "He's right." Then Haley spoke, her voice small. "I got a job," she whispered, "at the post office. I'll start next week. I'll pay you back, Emily, all of it." I swear I studied her. No makeup, no excuses, just a tired young woman staring at the pieces of her own reflection. It wasn't redemption yet, but it was a beginning. I exhaled slowly. "I'm glad you're trying," I said, "because this isn't just about the money. It's about respect for what's yours and for what isn't." Silence settled again, but it wasn't cold anymore. It was the silence that comes after a storm, when everything is still standing but forever changed. When I left that night, my father followed me to the porch. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. "I didn't think you would." "I almost didn't," I admitted, "but someone once told me that forgiveness without accountability isn't healing, it's surrender." He nodded, understanding, and for the first time, he didn't try to hug me. He just stood beside me, the rain tapping gently against the roof, two people finally speaking the same language: honesty. The next morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer. It was time to turn remorse into responsibility. The following week, I sat in a quiet downtown office, sunlight spilling across polished wood. My lawyer, Rachel Torres, listened as I explained everything: the forged signature, the pawn ticket, the repayment, the apology. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "You don't want to punish them," she said. "You want them to carry the weight." Exactly. Together we drafted a legal repayment contract, every dollar accounted for, every name written clearly. My parents, my sisters, and mine. No anger, just accountability. The document wasn't about revenge. It was a promise that consequences could exist without cruelty. When they signed it a week later, I felt something loosen inside me. The past didn't vanish. It simply stopped owning me. That night, I drove my Challenger up into the foothills. The city lights shimmered below like tiny confessions. I rolled down the window, let the wind tangle my hair, and thought about my grandfather's words. Real strength doesn't roar, Emily. It rebuilds. I wasn't seeking victory anymore. I was seeking peace, and I'd found it in the space between justice and mercy. If you've ever been the one who held everything together until it broke, remember this. Forgiveness without boundaries isn't kindness, it's permission. You can love people and still demand respect. You can walk away and still wish them well. And if stories like this remind you of your own strength, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to know that quiet justice is still justice, and that healing, when done right, can sound a lot like freedom.